Last week's selection of a U.S. cardinal as the next pope has lots of folks wondering about the new pontiff, now known as Pope Leo XIV, and what his selection means to the Catholic Church and to social and cultural issues worldwide. Joining us now is Catherine O'Donnell from ASU School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Good to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I like the title because there is history, there's philosophy, and there's religion with this pick. Who is Pope Leo XIV?
Well, as we know, he is the first American pope, which is in itself a remarkable development. He's an Augustinian friar, also the first. So he's a member of a religious community that is devoted to learning and also to good works, to working with vulnerable people, and has been for centuries. So he's spent much of his life outside of the United States as well.
Augustinian friar, you mentioned that, and again, that is a group that focuses on what? Just outwardly good works, these sorts of...
Yeah, so the Catholic Church has different religious communities within it. Francis was a Jesuit. The new pope is a member of the Augustinians. And their vow of poverty, they turn towards sharing. Okay. So he has spent his life in that community.
Was this selection a surprise?
It was absolutely a surprise. And I was laughing with some other people who kind of work on Catholicism, and we all said the one thing we were willing to predict was that it would not be an American, and we were wrong.
Why do you think he was chosen?
That's a great question. I mean, in hindsight, it does make sense. As Italian newspaper the week before the conclave said, you know, he's the least American of Americans, meaning he spoke many languages, he had lived abroad. He not to be irreverent, but he kind of checks the boxes that you want in a pope. So he does have this missionary component. He has spent his life in service to others. You can imagine him on a world stage, right? A pope is a global figure. And he also is an administrator, right? The Vatican is like the original bureaucracy. And he's had positions where he has had to know how to move the levers of a big organization.
Interesting. Okay, compare him to Pope Francis.
Yes. So I think it's important to note that he has embraced Francis's view of synodality, which is just a fancy way of saying the church should be a welcoming place in which many people, including lay people, participate in decisions. He's embraced that. But he walked out and he had, on that balcony, he was wearing more traditional papal garb. He reads Latin. There's some hope among conservative American Catholics that he will accept some of the more conservative cultural tenets that they believe in. I think that's an open question.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because the Catholic Church in America can be more conservative in many ways, but he doesn't seem quite as provocative as Pope Francis. Is that accurate?
Well, having learned not to predict, but I think that's correct. I mean, it's a little hard from what I've read and heard to imagine him walking up and down the aisle of his plane, kind of casually answering questions, which is something that Francis did. He's known as reserved and soft-spoken. But I think people are wrong to imagine that the Catholic Church can be mapped onto the American political or cultural environment. It's its own thing.
And so what is the significance of this being the first pope from the U.S.?
Yeah, it is significant that it was acceptable, right? I mean, for a long time, it didn't make sense practically because Americans didn't even get to Rome until after the conclave was over half the time. And then the United States was so powerful that to have those powers, spiritual and temporal overlap, seemed threatening. I would have thought, honestly, that an American pope would be either a rebuke to Trumpism or an embrace of it, and the cardinals would not have been willing to do that. Clearly, this figure was compelling enough and seemed potentially unifying enough that the conclave felt moved to select him. And we'll see. I mean, he is an American on the world stage who is not speaking for the nation. And that is just a new and interesting thing.
It sounds as though, from what I've read about the guy and heard about the guy, that Peru is almost his home country. I mean, he is very well known in Latin America. That had to make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. He speaks 5 or 6 languages. I believe he's a Peruvian citizen. Apparently, everyone in Chiclayo has their own story about him. And I think that made him seem a man of the church and not a man of the United States.
Can this particular pontiff, though, I mean, so much of the Catholic Church's growth in Latin America, in Africa, does he ring those bells? Will they listen? What has been the response on those 2 continents?
He has been embraced so far. I mean, there's been excitement in Latin America. There were a couple of African cardinals whose names were mentioned, so that may be a disappointment that one of them wasn't chosen. But we'll see. I mean, I think the thinking was he was sufficiently charismatic. I don't think he was chosen for that, but that he's not impossible to listen to.
So what do we watch for? What do we try to glean from his words and his actions?
Yeah, the church is a realm of symbols, right? So I think we'll see what decisions he makes about the Latin Mass, which is a flashpoint around which people have organized, some of whom are trying to pull the church back to something more traditional. Where does he go? Right? Where does he travel first? Where does he travel next? Does he continue to have sort of synods or bring groups in to talk to him about how the church should be run? How does he think about women in the church? I mean, there are so many questions.
Wow, there's so many questions and a lot of time and a lot of issues facing the church, and it'll be interesting to see about that. As you mentioned, Trumpism and American Catholicism and the whole 9 yards. You're going to be busy, Catherine O'Donnell, that's for sure, over at ASU. Good to have you here, though.
Thank you.